Imagine you're standing out in the blistering heat of the Egyptian desert, right?
Oh, wow. Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, you're sifting through centuries of dust and basically discarded rubbish,
Right.
and you brush away the sand from this tiny, fragile piece of papyrus. It's barely larger than a postage stamp, and it's covered in these faded Greek letters.
Which is an incredible image.
It is. And the thing is, that scenario isn't from some movie. It literally just happened recently.
Oh, the University of Hamburg thing.
Exactly. The University of Hamburg's analysis of this fragment that, well, it might actually be the earliest known physical piece of the Gospel of Mark.
That is just wild to think about.
Right. And when you hold something like that in your hands, you are essentially holding the epicenter of the most intense historical detective work in human history.
Absolutely.
Because, for 2,000 years, billions of people have worshipped Jesus of Nazareth. But for the last 2 centuries, historians have been quietly digging through the dirt, right? Digging through the texts, trying to pull off what seems kind of impossible.
Separating the historical guy from the theology.
Exactly. Separating the historical Galilean peasant from the eternal Son of God.
It really is the ultimate historical puzzle.
Mm.
And the book we are diving into today, which we're just referring to in our notes as the book, is this massive, multidisciplinary attempt to map out that exact puzzle.
Yeah, it's huge.
It aims to provide a totally cohesive overview of the historical Jesus for the 21st century. But, the author identifies a really fundamental problem of framing right in the preface.
Okay, let's unpack this. What kind of problem?
Well, the subject simply refuses to stay neatly within one academic discipline. Like, it's impossible.
Right, because everyone claims him.
Exactly. If you look at him strictly as a historian, you see a first-century Jewish preacher who was executed by the Roman state.
Right.
But if you put on the hat of a Christian theologian, you're looking at the incarnate Word of God.
Yeah, a totally different framing.
And then a comparative religionist sees a world religion founder, while a cultural historian sees a symbol that just gets infinitely repurposed by literally every generation.
So the mission of this deep dive today is to really extract those cohesive insights from this massive overview without, getting completely lost in the academic weeds.
Because the weeds are very deep.
They are very deep. And we need to lay down a crucial ground rule before we go any further, because if you are listening to this right now, you likely already have a perspective on this figure.
Almost everyone does.
Right. So our job today is not to preach to you, nor is it to debunk anything you might personally believe. We are acting strictly as neutral guides.
Just reporting the findings.
Exactly, reporting the findings mapped out in the source text. We're going to touch on some highly charged debates today, from fundamentalist theology all the way to radical skepticism and mythicism.
Oh yeah, we're going everywhere.
Yeah, and our only goal is to look at what the evidence says, what the scholars argue, and the actual mechanisms behind why they argue it. No taking sides.
And that neutrality is just so essential. Because before we can even begin to ask who this person was, we really have to grapple with how we know anything about him at all.
The detective work phase.
Right. We have an abundance of sources, but the nature of those sources is just incredibly complex. The most obvious starting point is the canonical Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
But if you're approaching this strictly as a historian, you hit a massive roadblock immediately, because the book points out that these are not modern biographies.
No, not at all.
You don't get his eye color, you don't get his height, or a timeline of what he was doing in his teenage years.
No, you get none of that.
Yeah.
Because the consensus dating puts the writing of these texts roughly between 70 and 100 CE.
So that's quite a bit later.
Yeah, that means we are talking about 40 to 70 years after the event supposedly took place.
Wow. Okay.
Furthermore, the authors were not detached journalists, carrying notepads around Galilee.
They had an agenda.
Exactly. They were devout members of communities that firmly believed this man had risen from the dead and was the Messiah.
Right.
So these texts were explicitly designed to strengthen faith, to convert the outsider, and in some cases, even to settle internal disputes within the early church.
So every single word is deeply saturated in theology.
Completely saturated.
So if you're listening to this and thinking, wait, aren't the Gospels just a bunch of theological PR written decades later by his biggest fans? You're touching on the historian's exact nightmare right there.
It is the ultimate nightmare.
How do you extract hard facts from memoirs written by deeply devoted followers? And, even before we get to the actual facts, how do historians even figure out who copied who?
Yeah, the literary puzzle.
The source text brings up the synoptic problem, which honestly just sounds like a massive headache.
Oh, it is a massive literary headache.
Okay.
But historians have developed some pretty fascinating mechanisms to solve it.
How does it work?
Well, when you lay the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, side by side, they can literally be seen together, which is what the word synoptic means.
Okay, seen together.
Right. And they share these huge, huge blocks of material. And not just similar stories, but exact, word-for-word, identical phrasing in ancient Greek.
But hold on, couldn't they have just memorized the stories perfectly? Because oral tradition was really strong back then, right?
That's a great question. Oral tradition is strong for, like, the core of a story or a punchline,
Right.
but it rarely preserves exact, lengthy syntax and weird grammatical quirks across multiple languages, especially when you remember they are translating from Aramaic, which is what Jesus spoke, into Greek.
Oh, right. Translation changes things.
Exactly. So when you see identical Greek sentence structures across different books, it strongly implies literary dependence. Someone was physically copying someone else.
Okay, so someone had a scroll in front of them.
Yes. And the dominant academic solution to this is called Markan priority.
Meaning Mark was first.
Right. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. The Greek is actually a bit rougher, and the narrative moves incredibly fast.
Like an action movie.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Scholars believe Mark wrote first, around 70 CE, which is right when the Romans were violently burning the Jerusalem temple to the ground.
Wow, okay. So Mark writes the foundational framework during this time of massive crisis.
Yes.
And then Matthew and Luke come along, what, a decade or two later, and they basically take Mark's scroll and essentially use it as their primary outline.
That's the consensus. They take Mark, they smooth out his rough Greek, and then they add their own unique material.
Okay, but here is where the detective work gets brilliant, right? Because Matthew and Luke share a lot of teachings, like the Lord's Prayer or the Beatitudes, that are absolutely nowhere to be found in Mark.
Exactly. Mark doesn't have them at all.
It's basically like two different college students handing in essays that have 3 paragraphs of the exact same text.
Yes.
They didn't copy each other's work directly, but they obviously both copied from the exact same external website.
That is a perfect analogy. Mark is their own original research, but that external website they both use for the extra stuff is what scholars hypothesize is the Q source.
Q standing for.
It comes from the German word Quell, which just means source.
Okay.
It was likely a lost collection of Jesus' sayings that was circulating around in the early church.
Okay, so that's the canonical puzzle, which is complex enough, but the book doesn't stop there. It brings up the Gospel of Thomas, which was discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945.
Yes, a massive discovery.
So what is this thing, and why wasn't it included in the Bible?
So the Gospel of Thomas is a non-canonical text, and it's basically just a collection of 114 isolated sayings of Jesus.
Just quotes.
Just quotes. There is no narrative framework at all. No birth in Bethlehem, no walking on water, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Just sayings.
That's so different from the others.
It is. Now, some of these sayings perfectly match the canonical Gospels, like the parable of the mustard seed.
Okay, sure.
But others take a sharp turn into something much, much more esoteric.
Give me an example of the weird stuff.
For instance, there's a part urging followers to become passers-by, or a saying where Jesus says the kingdom is both inside you and outside you, but it's hidden from the world.
The source text describes this as having a Gnostic flavor. And for those of us who don't have graduate degrees in ancient theology, what does that actually mean?
It's a great term to clarify. The word comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge.
Okay.
Broadly speaking, Gnosticism was a diverse set of ancient movements that believed the material, physical world was inherently flawed or evil.
Like the physical body is bad.
Exactly. They saw the physical world as a trap for the divine spark that lives within humans. In these systems, salvation doesn't come from a physical resurrection of the body or some sacrifice on a cross.
So how do you get saved?
It comes from acquiring secret, elite, intellectual knowledge. That gnosis, that knowledge wakes you up from the illusion of the material world.
Oh, wow. It's almost like the Matrix.
It is very much like the Matrix. So a text with a Gnostic flavor portrays Jesus less as a Jewish prophet dealing with sin and Israel's restoration, and a lot more as this cosmic revealer of secret wisdom.
Which totally explains why the early Orthodox Church rejected it. It's a completely different theological universe.
Entirely different.
But dating this Gospel of Thomas is notoriously difficult, right? The scholars fight over this.
Extremely difficult. It's a huge debate. Some scholars look at the sayings that overlap with the Synoptic Gospels and argue the core of Thomas might actually date back to the 50 CE.
Which would make it super early.
Very early evidence of how oral traditions circulated. But then other scholars look at that Gnostic vocabulary and argue, no, it's a much later 2nd century text that just heavily redacted and changed the earlier traditions.
But if we want the absolute earliest text, we don't look at the Gospels at all anyway, do we? We look at Paul.
Yes, the letters of the Apostle Paul are the absolute bedrock of the New Testament timeline. He was writing in the 50 CE.
So just 20 or so years after the crucifixion.
Exactly.
But wait, Paul never actually met Jesus during his earthly life. He wasn't one of the disciples walking around Galilee. So how does he help historians reconstruct the historical figure?
That is the key question. He helps because Paul quotes traditions that predate his own writings.
Oh, so he's repeating things he was taught earlier.
Right. The prime example the book highlights is in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received."
Okay, delivered and received.
That phrasing, delivered and received, is actually highly technical rabbinic language for passing on a strict oral tradition.
Like a formal memorization process.
Yes. And he then recites this creed, that Christ died for sins, was buried, was raised on the 3rd day, and appeared to Cephas, the 12, and hundreds of others.
So historians look at that and say, well, Paul is writing this letter in the mid-50s, but he's clearly quoting a formula he learned much earlier, maybe back in the 30s or 40s.
Exactly.
And that proves that the core belief in the resurrection wasn't just some legend that evolved a century later, kind of like a game of telephone. It was there instantly.
It anchors those massive theological claims to the immediate aftermath of the events.
Okay, so that's the Christian side. Let's step outside the Christian bubble for a second. Because if you're investigating a massive historical event, you don't just read the fan club's newsletter.
Right. You need outside verification.
You want the police reports, you want the hostile witnesses, the outside observers. What do the non-Christian sources tell us?
This is where we look at Flavius Josephus. He was a Jewish Roman historian who wrote toward the end of the 1st century.
Okay.
And he has a passage in his massive work, Antiquities of the Jews, known as the Testimonium Flavianum. It explicitly mentions Jesus, but it is one of the most hotly debated paragraphs in all of ancient history.
Because it sounds way too good to be true.
Oh, it is way too good to be true. As the manuscript exists today, it calls Jesus a wise man and then adds, if indeed one ought to call him a man, it explicitly states he was the Christ and claims he appeared alive on the 3rd day.
Okay, let me challenge that right now. Because Josephus was this aristocratic Jew who actually defected to the Romans during the war.
Yes, he did.
And he firmly believed the Roman Emperor Vespasian was the Messiah.
Exactly.
So there is absolute zero chance he wrote a paragraph proclaiming a crucified peasant in Galilee was the divine Christ. That makes no sense.
What?
So how do historians know which words to trust? Do they just kind of guess what he actually wrote originally?
No, they don't guess at all. They use really rigorous textual criticism.
How does that work?
They look for sudden jarring shifts in vocabulary and syntax. Josephus has a very specific, consistent Hellenistic writing style. Those glowing phrases about Jesus suddenly break that style entirely.
Like someone else took the pen.
Exactly. They use vocabulary that actually belongs to later Christian liturgical texts.
Ah, I see.
Furthermore, if you simply go in and delete those glowing, explicitly Christian phrases, the remaining paragraph flows perfectly in Josephus's normal voice.
What does the remaining text say?
It becomes a standard, slightly dismissive Roman report. It just says there was a teacher who gathered a following, was accused by the Jewish leaders, and was executed by Pilate.
Wow.
So scholars universally conclude that a later Christian scribe who was copying the manuscript centuries later just couldn't resist adding a little Orthodox upgrade to the text.
They just slipped it in there to make it sound better.
Basically, yes.
But the crucial thing is, beneath that tampering, we do have independent, non-Christian confirmation of his existence, his teaching, and his execution.
Yes, we do.
And we also have Roman sources, right, like Tacitus.
Tacitus is brilliant for historians because he is a highly hostile witness.
He didn't like them.
He detested them. Writing around 116 CE about the Great Fire of Rome under the Emperor Nero, Tacitus mentions that Nero blamed a group commonly called Christians.
Okay.
And just in passing, Tacitus explains that their founder, Christus, suffered the extreme penalty meaning crucifixion under the prefect Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius.
Tacitus despised the Christians, right? The book says he called Christianity a mischievous superstition.
Oh, he absolutely hated them, which is precisely why historians value his text so much.
Why is that?
Because if the Jesus movement had been entirely fabricated, a hostile, elite Roman historian with access to imperial records would have loved nothing more than to point out that their supposed founder was a total myth.
Right. He would have said, these people are following a ghost.
Exactly. But instead, he casually confirms the core historical data: the name, the time period, the prefect, and the specific method of execution.
And what about the Jewish rabbinic texts, like the Babylonian Talmud? Does the book cover that?
It does. Now, the Talmud was compiled much later, but it preserves earlier oral traditions. It contains these highly polemical references to a figure named Yeshu, who was hanged on the eve of Passover.
Hanged meaning crucified.
Yes, suspended on a tree.
Mm.
And it says he was executed for practicing sorcery and leading Israel astray.
Practicing sorcery, that's fascinating.
It is, because again, the mechanism of history is at work here. The opponents of early Christianity didn't deny that Jesus existed.
Right.
Nor did they deny he performed inexplicable miraculous deeds, nor did they deny his execution. They simply provided a highly antagonistic interpretation of those exact same facts.
They said, yeah, he did magic, but it was dark magic.
Exactly.
So we had the texts. But what about archaeology? Because we have 0 contemporary portraits of the guy. No trial transcripts. But the book argues that archaeology is what provides the high-definition backdrop for all of this.
Right. Direct physical evidence of a first-century peasant is nearly impossible to find.
Sure.
But we can absolutely verify the surrounding cast of characters. For a long time, for instance, critics argued Pontius Pilate might have been a later invention.
Really?
Yeah, because there was so little evidence outside the Gospels. But then in 1961, archaeologists digging in Caesarea uncovered the Pilate stone.
What's that?
It's a piece of limestone with a dedication to the Emperor Tiberius that clearly, explicitly identifies Pilate as the prefect of Judea.
Oh, wow. So proof in stone.
Literal proof in stone.
Uh,
We also have the Caiaphas ossuary, which is an ornate bone box discovered in 1990 that very likely belonged to the high priest who actually presided over Jesus' trial.
that is wild.
And we even found a first-century fishing boat, perfectly preserved in the mud of the Sea of Galilee.
The Galilee boat.
Yeah, discovered in 1986. It shows us exactly the kind of vessel the disciples operated. So archaeology grounds the texts in the deep physical reality of the first-century Mediterranean.
But this kind of brings us back to the historian's dilemma. If the primary texts are layered with decades of thick theology, and archaeology really only gives us the backdrop, how do modern scholars actually strip away the theology to find the man himself?
The Great Excavation Project.
Yeah, the book details this massive 200-year academic journey called the Quest for the Historical Jesus.
And this quest is defined by very specific methodologies. Historians don't just pick the verses they personally like. They developed strict tools, like the criterion of embarrassment.
I found this part so interesting. Explain the mechanism behind that. Why does embarrassment equal historical truth?
Because if a story is deeply awkward or embarrassing to the theology of the early church, it is highly, highly unlikely that they invented it out of thin air.
Okay, give me an example.
The classic example is the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist.
Right, because John was out there preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins.
Exactly. Now, the early church claimed Jesus was the sinless Son of God.
Right.
So why on earth would the sinless Son of God need to wade into a muddy river to be baptized for repentance by a lesser prophet?
Oh, I see. It makes Jesus look subordinate.
It makes him look subordinate, and it implies he needed to repent. It caused massive theological headaches for later Christians. We could actually see the later gospel writers trying to explain it away or minimize John's role.
Because it was just awkward for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it was so embarrassing, historians conclude it must be a stubborn historical fact. Everyone in the region knew it happened, so the gospel writers couldn't just omit it, they had to deal with it.
Another one of those embarrassing facts would be the crucifixion itself, right? Because the book notes that in Deuteronomy it says anyone hung on a tree is literally cursed by God.
Yes, inventing a Messiah who dies the most humiliating, cursed death imaginable in Roman society is the worst possible public relations strategy you could ever come up with.
It's a terrible pitch for a new religion.
Paul even explicitly calls it a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. You simply don't invent a crucified savior if your goal is to win ancient converts easily. Therefore, the crucifixion is considered rock-solid history.
So using these tools, scholars over the last 2 centuries have gone on this quest. But the source text outlines how this quest, historically, essentially just mirrored the anxieties of whatever era was conducting it.
That is the great trap of history, isn't it? The first quest kicked off in the 19th century, and it was heavily driven by Enlightenment thinkers and liberal European Protestants.
What were they looking for?
Scholars like Ernest Renan applied intense rationalism to the Gospels. They essentially went in with a scalpel and stripped away all the miracles. They cut out the exorcisms. They removed the apocalyptic warnings about the end of the world.
And what was left after all that surgery?
A gentle, idealistic, moral philosopher.
Wow. So they basically turned an ancient Jewish apocalyptic prophet into a polite 19th century European liberal who just wanted everyone to be kind to each other.
That is exactly what they did. It was a Jesus who fit perfectly into their own modern, rational sensibilities. But then, as the book details, the Schweitzer earthquake hit in 1906.
Albert Schweitzer, he wrote a book that just completely decimated that liberal view, didn't he?
The Quest of the Historical Jesus. It's a landmark book. Schweitzer reviewed all those 19th century biographies and effectively said, you people aren't looking at history. You are looking down a deep well and just seeing your own face reflected at the bottom.
Ouch.
Yeah, it was brutal. Schweitzer argued that the real historical Jesus was actually entirely alien to the modern, rational world. He wasn't some gentle moral philosopher.
What was he then?
He was a fiery, radical, first-century Jewish apocalyptic prophet.
Yeah.
He genuinely believed the physical world was going to end immediately. Schweitzer argued that Jesus tried to physically force the wheel of history to turn, and when it didn't turn, it crushed him.
Leaving him dying in despair on the cross?
Exactly.
I mean, that is dark. That's a very dark view. And it completely shattered the academic consensus at the time.
It was so devastating to the field that it launched what historians call the no-quest period, which lasted for almost 50 years.
People just stopped looking.
Pretty much. Heavyweight theologians, like Rudolf Bultmann, stepped in and argued that the historical Jesus was utterly inaccessible. And, more importantly to Bultmann, irrelevant.
Irrelevant how?
Bultmann argued that Christianity shouldn't rely on historical excavation of a first-century peasant. It should rely entirely on the Christ of faith being proclaimed in the present moment. The theology was all that mattered.
But you can't tell historians to stop digging forever.
No, you can't.
Eventually they started up again, which the book calls the third quest, starting broadly in the 1980s. And the defining feature of this modern era seems to be something that was honestly long overdue: re-Judaizing Jesus.
Yes. For centuries, Christian scholarship generally treated first-century Judaism as this dark, legalistic, backwards backdrop that Jesus supposedly came to completely dismantle.
Which is incredibly problematic.
It was historically flawed and dangerously anti-Semitic. The third quest finally recognized that you can only understand Jesus strictly within the context of Second Temple Judaism.
Right. He was Jewish.
Exactly. He wasn't a Christian arguing with Jews. He was a Jew engaging in fierce internal family debates with other Jews about how to be faithful to the Torah during a time of massive national crisis.
And this era also gave birth to something that feels incredibly controversial when you read about it: the Jesus Seminar. Founded in 1985. I read about their methodology in the book, and the optics of it are just wild.
Oh, the voting?
Yeah. Scholars sitting in a circle, reading sayings of Jesus out loud, and literally dropping colored beads into a box to vote on whether he actually said them.
It sounds like a reality show, but the methodology was meant to build a democratic consensus among scholars. But you're right, it drew intense fire.
How did the color coding actually work?
It was very strict. A red bead meant Jesus undoubtedly said it.
Okay.
A pink bead meant he probably said something very much like it. Gray meant he didn't say it, but it broadly aligns with his ideas. And a black bead meant he absolutely did not say it. It was entirely the later invention of the early church.
So what actually got a black bead versus a red bead?
Sayings where Jesus explicitly claims divinity, like the famous I am statements in the Gospel of John, almost universally received black beads.
Because they thought that was added later.
Right. The seminar argued the historical Jesus never went around explicitly declaring himself God. That was the later church's developed theology. On the other hand, the short, punchy, subversive parables like the Good Samaritan often got red or pink beads.
And what was their final tally?
By the end of their work, they concluded that only about 18% of the words attributed to Jesus in the Gospels were historically authentic.
18%. I mean, you can imagine the media circus that created in the 80s and 90s.
It was immense. Traditional and conservative scholars heavily critiqued the seminar. They argue the seminar started with a heavily biased anti-supernatural premise and essentially just voted to confirm their own skepticism.
Right.
But whether you agree with them or not, it perfectly illustrates the intense fracture in modern scholarship.
Which brings us to the cohesive overview of where academia stands today. The book outlines that, as of now, there isn't just one universally accepted historical Jesus. There are basically 4 dominant theories competing for supremacy.
Yes. The first and currently the dominant synthesis is the apocalyptic prophet.
This is kind of following Schweitzer, right?
Following heavily in the footsteps of Schweitzer, yes. Scholars like E.P. Sanders and Bart Ehrman argue that Jesus is best understood strictly as an end-times prophet.
What's the core of that message?
His primary message was that the present evil age was about to be catastrophically overthrown by God. God would establish a literal kingdom on earth, and people needed to repent immediately because the clock had essentially run out.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense of the intense urgency you read in the Gospels. What's the second theory?
The second is the cynic philosopher.
All right.
Scholars like John Dominic Crossan look at the exact same evidence and see something totally different. They argue Jesus wasn't obsessed with the end of the world at all.
Really? What was he obsessed with then?
They look at his lifestyle. He was wandering around with no possessions, relying entirely on charity, using these biting, witty aphorisms to mock the wealthy and powerful.
Right.
And this perfectly matches the profile of a Hellenistic cynic philosopher.
Just to clarify, when we say cynic, we don't mean a grumpy pessimist, like how we use the word today.
No. Ancient cynicism was a well-known philosophical movement. They believed that civilization, wealth, and status were inherently corrupting. So they lived radically simple countercultural lives, often in public, to shame the elites.
So proponents of this view see Jesus as a Jewish iteration of a cynic sage.
Yes, teaching a radically egalitarian lifestyle in the present moment, rather than predicting a future fiery apocalypse.
Okay. The third view is the prophet of social transformation.
This view heavily focuses on the brutal socioeconomic realities of Roman occupation. Scholars in this camp argue Jesus was primarily a political resistor,
Fighting Rome.
fighting the systemic economic exploitation of the peasantry by the Roman Empire and the complicit Jewish Herodian elite. They view him as a champion of the marginalized, organizing a literal grassroots resistance movement.
And the fourth view, which gets a massive amount of traction on the internet, like everywhere on YouTube, is the mythicist position.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The mythicist position argues that Jesus of Nazareth literally never existed at all.
Just a complete fiction.
Right. Proponents argue he was entirely a mythical construct, perhaps a celestial deity that later Christians gradually historicized, weaving him into earthly history, much like other dying and rising gods in Mediterranean mythology.
But the book makes a very deliberate point to pause here and clarify the actual academic standing of mythicism, because it's important.
It is very important. The book explicitly notes that while mythicism is highly visible online, it is virtually rejected by the entirety of the academic establishment.
And not just by Christian scholars.
None at all. Prominent atheist and agnostic historians universally reject it as well.
Why are they so sure?
Because the documentary evidence, specifically the independent non-Christian sources we talked about, like Josephus and Tacitus, and the very early letters of Paul, is just too strong.
Right.
The academic consensus is overwhelmingly that a historical man named Jesus lived in Galilee and was crucified by Pilate. Even if those same scholars spend their entire careers violently debating everything else about what he actually taught.
So if we want to figure out which of these theories, apocalyptic, cynic, or social prophet, actually fits the historical data best, we have to drop Jesus back into his physical world.
Yes, context is everything.
Because he didn't operate in a vacuum. He stepped into a highly combustible, politically occupied powder keg.
Powder keg is the exact right term for Roman Palestine in the first century.
Yeah.
You simply cannot understand the historical Jesus without understanding that landscape. The land was occupied by the Roman Empire, which was the most ruthlessly efficient military machine in human history.
Ruled by prefects like Pilate down in the south, in Judea, and client kings like Herod Antipas up in the north in Galilee. The book paints a picture of just immense economic anxiety, heavy taxation, massive building projects.
Take the city of Sepphoris, for example. It was a major Roman-style city being aggressively rebuilt by Herod Antipas during Jesus' lifetime. And it was located roughly 4 miles from Jesus' tiny hometown of Nazareth.
4 miles. So you have this microscopic rural agrarian village of maybe 300 people living on the absolute edge of starvation.
Yes.
And an hour's walk away is this gleaming Hellenistic metropolis funded by the taxes squeezed out of those exact same starving peasants.
The tension was suffocating, and that deep economic anxiety was completely intertwined with religious anxiety.
Because politics and religion weren't separate.
Not at all. The big question was, how do you remain a faithful Jew, faithful to the covenant, when pagans are taxing your land and ruling your people?
Right.
And the Jewish population was not a monolith in how they answered that question. The book breaks down the major factions, which is essential context.
Let's run through them because this explains exactly who Jesus is eventually going to clash with. First, the Pharisees.
The Pharisees were a highly popular grassroots lay movement. Their power base was actually in the local synagogues, out in the towns, not in the big temple in Jerusalem.
And what was their answer to Rome?
Their answer to the Roman occupation was purity. They believed that the written Torah needed to be applied to every single aspect of daily life, supported by a massive oral tradition of interpretation.
So keeping the law perfectly.
Exactly. They believed that if Israel could just maintain strict ritual and moral purity, God would honor the covenant and intervene to save them from Rome.
On the totally opposite end of the spectrum, you have the Sadducees.
The Sadducees were the aristocratic, wealthy elite. Their power base was entirely centralized in the Jerusalem temple. They were the priests.
And how did they handle the Romans?
Their answer was collaboration. They worked directly with the Roman authorities to maintain the status quo and, frankly, to keep their own power and wealth intact.
Wow.
Theologically, they were very conservative, actually. They only accepted the first 5 books of Moses. They entirely rejected the Pharisees' oral traditions, and they outright rejected the concept of the resurrection of the dead, which the Pharisees believed in.
Then you have a group that just essentially says, forget all of you, and leaves society entirely, the Essenes.
The Essenes looked at the corruption of the Sadducees running the temple, threw their hands up, and literally marched out into the desert. These are the people associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The desert communes.
Yes, they formed strict, apocalyptic, separatist communities. They believed the current establishment was entirely polluted, and they were waiting out in the wilderness for a cosmic, violent war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness.
And finally, the group that wanted that violent war to start right now, the Zealots.
The Zealots were radical. They believed that paying taxes to Caesar was literal treason against God.
So no compromising.
None. Their answer to the occupation was violent revolution. They believed God would not intervene to save them until the people picked up swords and physically started slitting the throats of the Romans and their Jewish collaborators.
So you have the purists, the wealthy collaborators, the desert separatists, and the violent revolutionaries. And blanketing all of this, stretching across the entire society, is a psychological state the source text calls apocalyptic eschatology.
Yes, that is the defining mood.
Which sounds like a big theological phrase, but if we want to understand the historical Jesus, we have to feel what these people were feeling on a daily basis.
Apocalyptic eschatology is the deep-seated belief that the fabric of reality is fundamentally broken and is about to be violently ripped open by God. Many Jews felt that even though they had returned from the Babylonian exile centuries ago and were living physically in their ancestral land, they were still spiritually and culturally in exile.
Because they were being ruled by pagan idolaters.
Exactly. They felt like strangers in their own home. They believed the present age was irredeemably evil under the actual dominion of dark demonic forces.
Right.
But they firmly believed an entirely new age was coming. They expected God to dramatically, violently intervene in history, perhaps through a messianic figure, to overthrow the Roman oppressors, restore the 12 tribes of Israel, and establish his physical, actual kingdom on earth.
It was a pressure cooker of expectation. They were basically just sitting there waiting for a spark.
And according to the historical record, that spark is John the Baptist. The book is absolutely adamant that you cannot understand Jesus without understanding John.
Because Jesus' public life literally starts by leaving Nazareth and seeking out John in the wilderness.
Right. And John is not just a quirky holy man eating locusts and wearing camel hair, which is how we often picture him. He is a profound political and economic threat to the establishment.
How so?
Think about what he's actually doing. He is standing out in the Jordan River, offering a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins.
Okay, and if you're wondering why that's a threat, think about the mechanics of the temple in Jerusalem. If you can walk down to a river and get your sins forgiven for free by some guy in the wilderness,
You don't need the temple.
right. You don't need to travel all the way to Jerusalem, change your Roman money into temple currency, buy an unblemished animal, and pay a priest to sacrifice it.
Precisely. John is entirely bypassing the centralized religious and economic monopoly of the Jerusalem temple. He is offering direct, immediate access to God's forgiveness outside the institutional structures.
That is massive.
It is. Furthermore, he is publicly calling out the moral corruption of the political leaders. He specifically targets King Herod Antipas for marrying his brother's wife, which was a blatant violation of Jewish law.
And you don't publicly humiliate a tyrant in the ancient world and expect to live very long.
Oh, no, you do not. Herod arrests John and beheads him. And this isn't just in the Gospels, by the way. Josephus explicitly confirms this in his historical writings. Yes. Josephus notes that Herod genuinely feared John's massive crowds would eventually be whipped up into a political rebellion. John was executed as an enemy of the state.
And it is exactly at this moment, right after his mentor is executed by the state, that Jesus steps out of the wilderness and begins his own ministry up in Galilee.
Yes, the timing is crucial.
But wait, if he knows John was just beheaded for riling up crowds, why does he start preaching the kingdom of God? I mean, in a territory occupied by the Roman Empire, preaching that a new kingdom is arriving is literally like shouting fire in a crowded theater. It is inherently seditious.
It is deeply, fundamentally dangerous. Which brings us to the core of his Galilean ministry. What exactly was he doing that drew such massive crowds?
Right.
The central theme of his teaching, which appears over 90 times in the Synoptic Gospels, is the kingdom of God.
But the book notes a very specific, complicated tension in how Jesus actually preached this kingdom. It is described as already but not yet.
Ah, yes, the already but not yet tension.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It means the kingdom wasn't just some ethereal place in the clouds you go to after you die.
Right.
But it also wasn't just a future cataclysmic military war against Rome. Jesus was claiming that God's sovereign reign was breaking into the present moment through his own actions.
So it's happening right now.
The kingdom was invading the present, but this kingdom demanded a total, radical inversion of societal values. The first will be last. The poor are blessed. The meek, not the militarily powerful Romans, will inherit the earth.
And his primary delivery mechanism for this radical message was the parable. But the source text makes it very clear that we fundamentally misunderstand parables today.
You really do.
We treat them like Aesop's fables, like comforting little bedtime stories that end with, and the moral of the story is be nice to people.
That is the exact opposite of how they functioned historically. Parables were subversive, deeply disorienting narratives designed to shatter the listener's worldview and literally force them to make a decision. They were theological traps.
Give me an example of the mechanics of a parable. How did they trap people?
Take the Good Samaritan. It's the most famous one. Today, the phrase Good Samaritan is slapped on hospitals or on laws that protect you if you break someone's ribs doing CPR, right?
Yeah, it just means a helpful, nice person.
But in the first century, Jews and Samaritans absolutely despised each other. It was a bitter, centuries-old ethnic and religious hatred.
Right. So Jesus is talking to a Jewish audience, likely including religious experts, and he tells a story where a man is beaten by robbers and left for dead on the side of the road.
A Jewish man.
Yes. A priest walks by and ignores him. A Levite walks by and ignores him. Both are absolute pillars of Jewish religious purity.
And then the hero of the story arrives, but it's not a Jewish layperson. It is a Samaritan, the hated enemy.
Wow.
The Samaritan is the one who shows compassion, binds his wounds, and pays for his medical care. Jesus isn't just telling people to be helpful. He is radically redefining the strict boundaries of God's covenant.
He's turning their world upside down.
He is forcing his audience to accept that their absolute worst ethnic enemy is their neighbor, and that the religious elite have utterly failed. It is an explosive political and theological statement.
Another one the book highlights is the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And honestly, this one still makes people angry today when they read it.
Because it violates every human instinct we have about economic fairness and merit.
Walk us through it.
A landowner goes out and hires workers for his vineyard at 6 a.m. Then he goes out and hires more at 9 a.m., noon, and even at 5 p.m., which is just an hour before quitting time.
Right.
At the end of the day, he pays the 5 p.m. guys a full day's wage.
So the 6 a.m. guys naturally think they are about to get a massive bonus.
because they work 12 hours in the blistering heat.
Exactly.
But the landowner pays the 6 a.m. guys the exact same wage.
Which is infuriating.
They are furious. But the landowner basically says, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity?
So what's the point of the trap there?
Jesus is subverting the entire human ledger of just deserts. He is portraying a kingdom where God's grace operates completely outside of human accounting systems and fairness.
And he didn't just tell stories about this radical grace. He acted it out physically in real life. The book spends a lot of time on what it calls the scandal of table fellowship.
In the ancient Mediterranean world, who you ate with wasn't just a matter of preference or who you liked.
Right.
It defined your social status, your honor, and your religious purity. The Pharisees, for instance, were incredibly meticulous about only eating with those who maintained the same rigorous purity standards.
So an open dinner table was just unthinkable.
Unthinkable.
Heh.
But Jesus throws the doors completely open. He actively eats with sinners and tax collectors.
And we really need to clarify what a tax collector was back then, because these were not just annoying IRS agents doing paperwork.
No, they were local Jews who had essentially bid for contracts from the Roman occupiers to collect taxes from their own people.
Oh.
They made their profit by extorting extra money from their neighbors on behalf of the pagan empire.
Mm-hmm.
They were viewed as traitors, collaborators, and ritually unclean outcasts.
And Jesus doesn't just eat with them. He calls one of them, Levi or Matthew, depending on the gospel, to be one of his inner circle of disciples.
Yes.
To the religious establishment, this wasn't just weird or eccentric. It was a profound insult to the purity of the nation.
It was a shocking physical enactment of the exact kingdom he was preaching about. He was enacting God's indiscriminate grace in real time, obliterating social and religious boundaries.
Which naturally leads us to the miracles and healings. Now remember our ground rules. Historians cannot validate the supernatural in a laboratory.
Right, they can't prove a miracle.
But what does the historical consensus say about these events?
The consensus, even among highly skeptical scholars, is that Jesus was widely known during his actual life as a healer and an exorcist. This is confirmed by multiple independent strands of tradition.
So people definitely saw him doing something.
Yes. Even his bitterest enemies didn't deny that he was doing inexplicable things. They just attributed his power to the devil. That's the famous Beelzebul controversy, where they claim he casts out demons by the prince of demons.
But the book argues we really need to look past the magic trick aspect of the miracles. It focuses heavily on the socio-political meaning behind them. Like, what does healing a leper actually do in the first century?
In that culture, a severe skin disease like leprosy didn't just mean you were physically sick, it meant you were ritually impure.
Unclean.
According to Levitical law, you had to tear your clothes, live outside the camp, and literally shout unclean when people approached you.
That's horrifying.
You were entirely severed from your family, your community, and the religious life of the temple. It was effectively a social death.
So when Jesus reaches out and physically touches the leper, which makes himself ritually impure, by the way, and heals the person, he isn't just curing infected cells.
Not at all. He is restoring that person to the social fabric. He is handing them back their humanity and their rightful place in the community. It is a radical act of social restoration.
And the exorcisms function similarly, don't they?
Yes. In a worldview steeped in apocalyptic eschatology, sickness and demonic possession were seen as the literal grip of Satan on God's creation. By casting out demons, Jesus was demonstrating that the kingdom of God was actively invading enemy territory.
He's taking the territory back.
Exactly. He was binding the strong man, as he put it, and plundering his house.
Okay, let's step back and look at the board here. You have this peasant up in Galilee. He is upending the entire social order with these subversive stories. He is acting like he has the personal authority to forgive sins.
Yep.
He is completely ignoring strict purity laws to eat with traitors and prostitutes. He is performing healings that draw massive, unmanageable crowds.
It's a powder keg.
If he had just stayed up north in the countryside, maybe he would have lived. But he decides to take this entire movement south, directly into the belly of the beast, Jerusalem.
The Galilean ministry was always on a direct, unavoidable trajectory toward a catastrophic clash with the religious and political establishment. It was a collision course from day one.
And the book details these escalating clashes, particularly with the Pharisees.
The debates were incredibly fierce and public. There were massive controversies over the Sabbath. His disciples pluck heads of grain on the Sabbath, and Jesus heals a man with a withered hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath.
Which was strictly forbidden.
When the Pharisees challenge him for breaking the law of resting, he drops a bombshell. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
Oh.
He essentially claims authority over the interpretation of their most sacred institutions.
There are also huge debates over ritual purity, like hand washing.
Yes, the Pharisees criticize his disciples for eating with unwashed, ritually impure hands. Jesus responds by striking at the very core of their entire purity system.
What does he say?
He says, "There is nothing outside a person that by going into them can defile them, but the things that come out of a person are what defile them." He internalized purity, focusing on the human heart rather than external rituals.
And this all culminates in the devastating 8 woes in Matthew 23, where he publicly, repeatedly calls the scribes and Pharisees hypocrites and whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of dead bones inside.
It's blistering rhetoric.
It is. But I want to pause here because the source text makes a point that is absolutely vital for modern readers to understand, especially regarding the history of anti-Semitism.
This is a crucial clarification. When we read these clashes today, we often read them through the tragic lens of 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism.
Right.
We imagine Christianity aggressively attacking Judaism.
Right.
But historically, that is entirely false. Jesus was a Jew. His disciples were Jews. The crowds he preached to were Jews. He worshipped at the Jewish temple.
This was a family fight.
Precisely. It was an intense, passionate, intra-Jewish debate. It was a debate between different Jewish factions about the correct way to interpret the Torah and be faithful to God's covenant during a time of immense national crisis.
So the rhetoric is harsh because the stakes were ultimate for their nation, not because it was a different religion attacking Judaism.
Exactly.
So the tension is just boiling over, and Jesus orchestrates his final journey to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. And the city's population swells immensely with pilgrims during Passover, right?
Oh, massively.
And the Roman guards are on extremely high alert because Passover literally celebrates the Jewish exodus from Egypt. It's a celebration of liberation from a foreign oppressor.
The worst possible time for a riot.
The atmosphere is absolutely electric. And Jesus orchestrates what we call the triumphal entry.
He deliberately rides into the city on a donkey while crowds lay down branches and shout, "Hosanna!"
And this isn't just a casual mode of transportation.
No, it is highly choreographed political theater. He's intentionally fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9, presenting himself as the humble, messianic king arriving in peace.
And what does he do immediately after this incredibly provocative entrance? He goes straight to the economic heart of the nation, the temple.
The cleansing of the temple. He enters the outer courts, overturns the tables of the money changers, and physically drives out those selling sacrificial animals.
Now, the book notes a crucial historical distinction here, because we often think of this as Jesus just getting angry about price gouging or capitalism in a sacred space.
Right, but the temple was the size of several modern football fields.
Oh, wow.
Flipping a few tables in one corner isn't going to shut down the daily operations of this massive complex.
So what was the point?
The historian's view is that this was a prophetic, symbolic act. In the tradition of the Old Testament, prophets like Jeremiah smashing a clay pot to symbolize the destruction of the nation, Jesus was symbolically enacting the destruction of the entire temple establishment.
He was predicting its fall.
Yes. He was protesting a system that he believed had fundamentally failed in its purpose, to be a house of prayer for all nations, instead becoming a den of robbers focused on exclusivity and financial monopoly. He was declaring God's judgment on the elite system.
That is the point of no return. I mean, you do not threaten the religious and economic center of the nation during the most volatile week of the year while the Roman prefect is in town with his legions and expect to walk away.
No. The authorities recognize him immediately as a direct threat to the fragile peace with Rome, and they move to eliminate him. Which leads to the Last Supper, a Passover meal with his disciples on Thursday night.
The source text outlines how this single meal has generated just endless theological warfare over the centuries.
Oh, centuries of debate.
What exactly did he mean when he broke bread and said, "This is my body"? Is it literal transubstantiation? Is it symbolic? Is it a memorial?
The book outlines all those later theological debates, but it really focuses on the historical moment. Jesus is consciously anticipating his own violent death and interpreting it for his followers in advance. He is associating his impending execution with the inauguration of a new covenant.
Later that night, he is betrayed, arrested, and dragged through a series of trials. First, a Jewish trial before the high priest, Caiaphas, and the Sanhedrin.
The Jewish authorities question him about his teaching, his threats against the temple, and his identity. The core charge here is religious
Right.
blasphemy.
Right.
He is making claims to divine authority that fundamentally threaten the established order. But the Jewish authorities do not have the legal right to execute him under Roman occupation.
So they have to hand him over to the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. And Pilate couldn't care less about Jewish purity laws or blasphemy, could he?
Not at all. If we connect this back to the mechanism of Roman imperial rule, Pilate has exactly one job: maintain the Pax Romana, keep the peace, and collect the taxes.
That's it.
The only charge Pilate cares about is sedition. Is this man claiming to be king of the Jews? Is he a rival to Caesar?
Right.
Because if this Galilean peasant is causing a riot during Passover, he is the threat to the stability of the entire province. So Pilate condemns him to the cross.
And the book is very specific about the brutal reality of crucifixion. We wear crosses on necklaces today, but in the first century, it was the ultimate horror.
Crucifixion was not merely a method of execution. It was a specific, engineered instrument of Roman state terror.
State terror.
Yes, it was generally reserved for slaves, pirates, and political rebels against the empire. Roman citizens were actually legally protected from it.
It was meant to send a message.
Exactly. It was engineered to be as agonizing, prolonged, and publicly humiliating as humanly possible. The victim was stripped naked and hung along major public roadways. It was a bloody billboard that communicated a very clear message. This is what happens when you challenge the authority of Rome.
The source material dives into the 7 last words of Jesus on the cross, specifically focusing on his cry of dereliction, quoting Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me?
It is one of the most profoundly ambiguous and haunting moments in the entire historical record.
How do scholars interpret it?
Some scholars read it purely historically, as the expression of a crushed, failed visionary who realized at the very end that God was not going to intervene to save him. The apocalypse didn't arrive.
Okay.
But others read it theologically, noting that while Psalm 22 begins in absolute despair, it ultimately ends in a declaration of God's vindication and triumph. The ambiguity is just striking.
He dies, and the book notes a highly specific detail. He is buried by a man named Joseph of Arimathea. And historians actually trust this specific detail. Why is that?
We go right back to the criterion of embarrassment.
Oh, okay.
Joseph of Arimathea is described as a member of the Sanhedrin, the very Jewish council that had just condemned Jesus to death.
Right.
Meanwhile, all of Jesus' hand-picked disciples have fled in absolute terror to save their own lives.
Yeah.
Why would the early Christians invent a story where their own founders are cowards, and a member of the enemy council is the one who steps up to respectfully bury their master in a rock tomb?
It makes them look terrible.
It is way too embarrassing to be fiction. It is historically solid.
So we have a dead peasant preacher sealed in a rock tomb outside Jerusalem. Historically speaking, we know exactly what is supposed to happen next. There were dozens of messianic claimants in the first century.
Many of them.
The Romans crucified all of them. And when the Messiah is crushed, the movement is over. The followers either go back to their fishing nets or they find a new Messiah to follow.
Right.
But they absolutely don't start a global religion worshiping the executed guy. So how do we get from a dead Jewish peasant to a massive movement that eventually conquers the Roman Empire?
This brings us to the historical bedrock of the resurrection. Again, historians cannot prove a supernatural miracle, but they must account for the historical data that was left behind.
They have to explain what happened.
And the book outlines several widely accepted historical facts that absolutely demand an explanation.
Okay, fact number 1. The empty tomb.
The tomb was undeniably empty. We know this because even the earliest Jewish critics of Christianity claimed that the disciples had stolen the body.
Why does that matter?
If the body was still rotting in the tomb, you don't accuse the disciples of stealing it. You just walk over to the tomb, point to the corpse, and shut the entire movement down in an afternoon.
Oh, that makes sense.
The accusation of theft is a tacit admission by hostile witnesses that the body was, in fact, missing.
Fact number 2. The appearances.
Various followers, both individually and in large groups, sincerely claim they saw him alive after his death.
Fact number 3. The psychological transformation.
This is massive. The disciples went from terrified fugitives hiding behind locked doors because they thought they were going to be crucified next,
Right, they were terrified.
to bold proclaimers who marched straight into the public squares of the Roman Empire, fully willing to be tortured and martyred for the specific claim that Jesus was resurrected. Something radical happened to completely invert their psychology.
And fact number 4, the unexpected conversions of hostile witnesses.
Yeah, you have James, Jesus' own brother. During Jesus' life, the Gospels record that his family literally thought he was out of his mind.
Yeah.
Yet after the crucifixion, James suddenly becomes the prominent leader of the Jerusalem church and is eventually martyred for it.
Wow.
And then you have Paul, a strict Pharisee who was actively, violently persecuting the early church, dragging Christians to prison.
Right, he hated them.
He claims to have seen the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, and he completely pivots, becoming the greatest missionary in Christian history.
So the historian has to look at all 4 of those facts: the empty tomb, the appearances, the psychological shift, and the hostile conversions, and offer some kind of explanation. The book outlines the competing naturalistic theories scholars have proposed over the years. Let's run through them.
Sure. There's the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He just passed out from shock, was placed in the cool tomb, woke up a few days later, managed to roll away a massive stone from the inside with pierced hands, hobbled over to his disciples, and somehow convinced them he was the glorified Lord of life.
Which is universally rejected by modern doctors and historians, right? Because Roman executioners didn't bungle crucifixions, they were professionals.
Exactly. Then there is the hallucination theory, that the grief-stricken disciples, desperate for their master to be alive, simply hallucinated his appearances.
Does that hold up?
Critics point out that while individual hallucinations certainly happen, group hallucinations are incredibly rare. Furthermore, it completely fails to explain the empty tomb, nor does it explain the conversion of Paul, who wasn't grieving Jesus at all, but was actively trying to destroy his movement.
There is also the wrong tomb theory, that the women just got confused in the dark, went to an empty cave, and panicked.
Which, again, fails to account for the post-resurrection appearances, or the simple fact that the authorities could have just gone to the right tomb to produce the body and end the rumors.
Opposed to all these naturalistic explanations is, of course, the theological claim of a literal bodily resurrection.
Right.
The source text remains entirely neutral here, making it clear that while history can meticulously map out the explosive effects of the belief in the resurrection, validating the miracle itself steps beyond the boundary of history and into the realm of faith.
Exactly.
But the undeniable reality is that this singular belief launched the Christian church.
And it launched centuries of intense theological development, primarily the rise of Christology, the study of the nature of Christ. The early church had to wrestle with a monumental theological paradox.
What was the paradox?
They were devout Jews steeped in strict monotheism, the absolute belief in one indivisible God. Yet they were actively worshiping Jesus, singing hymns to him, and praying to him. How do you reconcile that?
It wasn't solved overnight, right?
No, it took centuries of brutal, incredibly complex debate, culminating in the major church councils. The Council of Nicaea and eventually the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE finalized the Orthodox doctrine.
Which was?
That Jesus was one person with 2 distinct natures, fully God and fully human, perfectly united without confusion or division. It was a massive philosophical achievement to articulate that mystery.
But the legacy of this figure doesn't stop at the borders of Christianity. The book dedicates a really fascinating section to how Jesus is viewed across other world religions today.
He is a central figure globally. In Islam, he is known as Isa in Arabic, and he is deeply, deeply revered.
What's the Islamic view of him?
The Quran considers him one of the greatest prophets, born of a virgin by the Spirit of God, who performed massive miracles. Interestingly, classical Islamic theology denies his crucifixion entirely, arguing that he was ascended directly to heaven and someone else actually died on the cross in his place.
And modern Judaism has engaged in a major reclamation project regarding him, haven't they?
Exactly. For centuries, the relationship was defined by Christian persecution of Jews. But recently, Jewish scholarship has intensely reclaimed Jesus' Jewishness.
Right.
Scholars like Geza Vermes have positioned him firmly within the tradition of charismatic Galilean holy men, acknowledging him as a brilliant ethical teacher and a faithful Jew, even while completely rejecting his divinity.
Even Eastern religions engage with him.
Yes, prominent Buddhist leaders like Thich Nhat Hanh have written extensively about Jesus, viewing him not as an atoning sacrifice, but as a great bodhisattva, an enlightened being who taught the path of deep compassion and mindfulness.
Which leads us perfectly to the ultimate thesis of the book, its grand cohesive insight after all this historical and theological excavation.
The main takeaway.
Yeah, you cannot neatly surgically remove the historical Galilean peasant from the Christ of faith.
You really can't. They are inextricably layered atop one another in the historical record.
Right.
The historical Jesus, the Jewish prophet walking the dirt roads of Galilee, is the absolute foundation behind all the imagery. He grounds the entire movement in human history.
But the Christ of faith, the resurrected Lord experienced by the early church, is the only reason anyone remembered the historical figure to write about him in the first place.
Exactly. That fusion of history and theology makes him the most infinitely malleable, endlessly compelling, and profoundly influential symbol in human history.
Wow. We have covered a staggering amount of ground today. We started with a tiny papyrus fragment in the Egyptian sand. We waded through the methodological muddy waters of textual criticism. We stepped into the political powder keg of Roman Palestine.
We really did.
We analyzed the subversive traps of his parables and traced the collision course that ended on a Roman cross and an empty tomb that undeniably changed the world. We want to thank you for joining us on this expansive deep dive into a profoundly complex figure.
It's been a journey.
It really is a testament to the power of viewing history through multiple rigorous lenses and resisting the urge to simplify the past just to make it fit comfortably into our modern boxes.
And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final reflection to mull over, drawing directly from the book's conclusion.
Let's hear it.
The text points out that across the centuries, every era inevitably reconstructs Jesus in its own image. The 19th century Enlightenment scholars looked at the data and saw a gentle, liberal moralist.
Right.
Today, many modern scholars look at the exact same data and see a radical social revolutionary or a countercultural cynic philosopher. If the quest for the historical Jesus is often a mirror reflecting the generation that studies him, you have to ask yourself, what does our modern preference for a politically subversive, culturally rebellious Jesus actually reveal about the anxieties, the systemic frustrations, and the deeper desires of our own society today?
That is a phenomenal question. Are we actually looking clearly at first century history, or are we just looking into a very old mirror? Keep questioning, keep looking closer at the mechanisms behind what you read, and keep learning. We will see you on the next deep dive.